But one and the same Spirit works all these things, distributing to each one. Would you mind just saying each one again? Individually as he wills. Now, let me just say something to you that I believe about the gifts that maybe you've never even heard. I believe the gifts are owned by the Holy Spirit. They're his gifts. And I don't believe any one believer has one of these gifts. I believe the Holy Spirit has all of these gifts, and he gives to each believer as that believer has a need and as he wills. So I believe any believer at any time can have a word of knowledge. Any believer at any time can have a gift of faith or a miracle or a healing. Any believer. And that's what's wonderful, because the Holy Spirit gives to each one individually for the profit of all, or as he wills. You see what I'm saying? So they belong to him. So I'm going to take these 9 gifts and I'm going to touch on them. I can only touch on them, obviously, in one weekend message. But what we're going to do is divide them into 3 categories. And I think they can be, it's a good way to help remember what they are. Number 1, the discerning gifts. Now, again, if you have your notes, and you should, by the way, if you have your notes, we've got the discerning gifts, the declarative gifts, and the dynamic gifts. Those are 3 categories. But I thought about 3 other words if you want to use these as categories, so you could write them beside. Beside the discerning gifts, we could put the perceiving gifts. The perceiving gifts. Beside the declarative gifts, we could put the proclaiming gifts. We proclaim with those, or do we declare? And besides the dynamic gifts, we could put the power gifts. All right? So they could be called the perceiving, the proclaiming, and the power, or the discerning, the declarative, and the dynamic. All right. Among the discerning gifts are 3. The word of knowledge, the discerning of spirits, and the word of wisdom. Let me tell you what a word of knowledge is, all right? A word of knowledge is to know something specific without having learned it by natural means. To know something specific without having learned it by natural means. In other words, the Holy Spirit tells you something that you didn't learn, you just know it just like that. And we need this very, very much. When Jesus said to the woman at the well, go call your husband, she said, I don't have a husband. He said, well, you spoke truly in that. You've had 5. The one you're living with now is not your husband. Okay, that's a word of knowledge by the Holy Spirit. Now, I understand you say, well, Jesus is God. But you have to remember, when Jesus was on this earth, he moved through the power of the Holy Spirit. So that's an example of a word of knowledge. I was in a restaurant one time. There was this great big weightlifter. And he walked in. It was a cafeteria. He walked in carrying his tray. And immediately I knew something. And I walked over to him and said, can I tell you, at first I started, I always look for a good start when I walk up to people I don't know. I said to him, can I ask you a question? And he said, yeah. He's sitting there with his wife. I said, have you ever lifted weights? I thought it'd be an icebreaker, And he said a few times. So, and I found out later he was a bodybuilder. And won, national Mr. America, whatever. So I go up, and so I said to him, I know this is going to sound strange, but the Holy Spirit spoke something to me about you. Would you mind if I shared it? And you should have seen his face. I mean, he just, his eyes got big. He looks at his wife. I found out later they'd been talking about just talking about it. And he said, no, please, go ahead. He said, sit down. So I sat down at the table, and I said to him, the Holy Spirit told me that when you were young, I saw you sitting in your grandmother's lap. You were crying. You were a little boy. And she told you that God could make you strong like Samson if you would serve him. And you committed that if God made you strong like Samson, you would serve him. And God's here to tell you that he kept up his end of the deal, but you didn't keep up your end of the deal. Now, you need to be right about these things. Well, these big tears welled up in his eyes. He looked at his wife, couldn't believe it. He said, I was just telling my wife that story. He said, when I was a little boy, some boys were throwing rocks at me. They hit me in the head. I was raised by my grandmother. My father left when I was born. My mother left a few years later. And I went home. She told me the story of Samson. I sat in her lap. She told me that. I was just telling my wife that story. And we led them both to the Lord. I led them both to the Lord, and they got baptized the next week. So that's a word of knowledge. See, I couldn't have known that by natural means. Okay, let me just tell you something. That's fun. And it's really easy to witness that way too, by the way. So that's word of knowledge. Here's the second, discerning of spirits. Discerning of spirits is to be made aware of the presence of a demonic spirit. To be made aware of the presence of a demonic spirit. Now listen to me again. This gift is called the discerning of spirits. It is not called the gift of discernment. By the way, the gift of discernment's not listed in the Bible. There's no such gift. You need discernment. We're told to be discerning. We're told to discern between good and evil. I understand that. But I'm going to say something kind of strong because I don't have a lot of time. Okay, so I'm just going to go ahead and say it. Many people that I've met who have said to me, you know, I have the gift of discernment, actually have the gift of criticism. And they try to let their judgment of other people be God's judgment. And it really bothers me. You do not have the gift of discernment. It's not in the Bible. There is a gift called the discerning of spirits. It's to be made aware of a demonic spirit. Paul did this in Acts 16. Don't have time to read it. But he discerned their evil spirit in a woman, turned around and cast the woman out. Okay. Wouldn't it be good if there was a demonic spirit coming against your business and the Holy Spirit made you aware of it? I asked you a question. Yes? Okay. Wouldn't it? Especially right now. Here's what I want to tell you. These gifts are good gifts. It'd be good for the Holy Spirit to make you aware of this, all right? Wouldn't it be good to know if there's a demonic spirit coming against your marriage or one of your teenagers? And you could rebuke that spirit. All right, so here's the third, the word of wisdom. The word of wisdom is a divine answer or solution for a particular event. A divine answer or solution for a particular event. John 9, verse 29, they're talking to this blind man that got healed, who got in a lot of trouble because he got healed by the religious people. And verse 29, they said, we know that God spoke to Moses. As for this fellow, we don't know where he's from. Speaking of Jesus. Now watch his answer. The man answered and said to them, why, this is a marvelous thing that you don't know where he's from, and yet he opened my eyes. That's pretty good. Then he goes on to say, if he weren't from God, he couldn't do this. And it was a word of wisdom, so much so they couldn't even answer. But the man had just gotten saved. He wouldn't know this. It's like the Holy Spirit just spoke to him. Okay, we've had this so many times. You've had words of wisdom. When you've been praying about something to do, you hadn't known what to do in your business, you hadn't known what to do in your job, you haven't known what to do in a relationship, and all of a sudden God's answer, God's solution comes. That's a word of wisdom. You see what I'm saying? All right, so here's the second category, the declarative gifts. The declarative gifts.